I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Richard Nixon resigning the office of the presidency 40 years ago this week. The culmination of a scandal that not only brought down an administration, but shook America's faith in government to its very core. And 4 decades later, that faith is once again being tested, with one recent poll finding that just 19% of voters trust the federal government to do the right thing almost always or most of the time. We're back with Dan Henninger. Wall Street Journal editorial board member Dorothy Rabinowitz also joins the panel. Dorothy, America, 1974. The same America as 2014?
Oh, no. And, of course, we cannot blame this on Richard Nixon, but it's a point from which we see the America of Richard Nixon's time as the beginning of what we have now. There was then, facing Richard Nixon, a counterculture. You remember the counterculture? They don't want to read about dead white men in literature like Shakespeare. They're out in the streets fighting against the government for the war, burning draft cards, essentially thinking of the United States as the enemy of all that is good and true. That was the seed moment. What was the counterculture is now the reigning culture, the central culture.
And that's the difference.
That is the difference. Now this is the norm. It is the norm to go into a university, for example, and find out that every group has been separated into little victim studies classes instead of reading the great canon and literature. It is so normal. And so, and the sense that America, which was once celebrated, for example, in its history, people went to school, the westward expansion, is now a trail of blood. Is now a trail.
Different culture.
Different culture.
Dan, I want to just read to the audience what you wrote in the Wall Street Journal, linking today's America and the IRS scandal. Here's what you said. The IRS Tea Party audit story isn't Watergate, it's worse than Watergate. The Watergate break-in was the professionals of the party in power going after the professionals of the party out of power. The IRS scandal is the party in power going after the most average Americans imaginable.
Yeah, well, the thing that hasn't changed, Stuart, is that the politicians themselves haven't changed. I mean, back then when Richard Nixon had the plumbers, they were attacking the Democratic National Committee's offices at Watergate, trying to find out what was in their files. The IRS attacks were on groups of normal citizens. I mean, the Obama administration clearly sicked the most fearful, powerful agency in government on people who were just doing politics out there. So to some extent, it has changed from simply bumper car fighting back in the 70s to total war now. And that's, I think, a much more ominous development. The irony is that in neither case was it really necessary. Richard Nixon beat George McGovern in 1972 in an overwhelming landslide of victory. It really wasn't necessary for him to find out what the Democrats were doing. And as for attacking these Tea Party groups, the Obama campaign had a well-oiled machine using social media that was going to be very difficult to defeat in any event. But they were so crazed with the idea that they had an organized opposition that they couldn't stand it and went after them. And that is the abuse that existed then and exists now.
But they thought what they were doing within the IRS was entirely legitimate to keep President Obama in power. They thought that was a legitimate thing to do, to wield the machinery of government against the president's political opponents.
Well, I think that's what Nixon's plumbers thought.
Yeah, that's right. If you live in a bubble of your belief, yes, they did. If you study Nixon's plumbers, yes, we have to get this done. Some part of them said, you know, if I listen to this plan to break into Ellsberg's headquarters, you know, this government will come down. But they went ahead anyway, because, and that's the same as what is going on in Obama's time.
You are profoundly disappointed, aren't you?
Well, I look back at the history of the Nixon era, and you see there the growth of everything that produced Barack Obama. the left, tenured radical product of Harvard Law School, with all of the assumptions I just outlined before about American power, bad thing. American culture needs to be fixed. All of that was produced there. It has been an inexorable growth from that time.
As I said, you are profoundly disappointed, Dorothy.
Well,
yes.
I'll tell you one thing we should remember about Richard Nixon. For all of his status, you know, Kevin Spacey, you know, the actor Kevin Spacey, asked who did the most for the arts. He said, I know you'll be surprised to learn that it was Richard Nixon who did the most for the arts. He doubled arts funding. He produced, you remember something called Title IX, the thing that changed every girl's professional athlete status? He made it impossible, you know, for women to do all of this.
But if I may say so, Dorothy, those were the seeds that planted to grew up to the government as the scale
Yes.
it is now. And I think the government's incompetence is the reason the people in that opinion poll we cited have lost faith in Washington, because it simply doesn't perform anymore.
Dan, Dorothy, out of time. Thank you very much indeed.